American Television with Mitchell Hadley is the show. And we're going to just do a brief little segment here, maybe 25, 30 minutes. I recently was in a conversation with an old friend who asked me some questions about why I was doing this. They didn't they hadn't realized that I had known about a certain show or a certain person. They also wanted to know how I hooked up with Mitch. So we're going to do just a thing here, talk a little bit about this show, where we came from as television watchers, and maybe ask a few questions of each other back and forth about things we don't know. Let me just state that I started the Dan Schneider video interviews back in 2014, December of 2014, and I've done so far 400 and something episodes of that. A handful of episodes was done with Mitch, another fellow, I think his name might have been Daniel, and also Amanda Reyes. And then
Dan Budnick.
Dan Budnick, right? Yeah. And then 3 or 4 or 5 years passed, and I'd done maybe 4 or 5 shows with Mitch and those folks, and I hadn't heard from him. I think I might have contacted him about something, but he was busy. And about a year later, he retired. Mitch here, said he was willing to do something, and I had been getting this idea of maybe doing something longer form, sort of. I had grown up, speaking of television, I'd grown up watching the old BBC series, The World at War. And so doing 25, 30, 50 things about this, even if it's just two guys talking rather than having clips from all the shows, I thought of something that would be interesting. And Mitch wanted to do it. And so, we kicked around some ideas, and the format that you've seen in now almost 24 shows is what we came up with. So let me just turn it over then to Mitch for any of his ideas or recollections about first doing this show, and then wherever we go.
Well, I remember it pretty much the same way that you had talked about doing a regular series on the history of television, and that we would look at different genres as well as different decades, different aspects of TV. And I found that really interesting, because one of the things that I most enjoy about television is looking at it in a cultural context. I think that TV is a great mirror to what happens to be going on at a particular time. And I write about it now, but even before I wrote about it, I had a small collection of TV guides that I kept for my own amusement. And as I would read through them, I would notice particular trends or issues, things that keep coming up over and over and over again. And it began with news stories where you could look at the late 60s and early 70s, and the emphasis is on the Middle East, escalating wars, the environment, drugs, everything that we talk about today. And then I began to notice that in the descriptions of a lot of the TV series that were on, that the same topics were coming up over and over again, that you'd not that they were reusing plots, but that you would see certain things, certain storylines or certain issues being discussed within the context of a drama that are virtually the same things that people were talking about today. And so from there, I got this interest in looking at the history of television and what's been written about it and what it has broadcast, and seeing what that tells us about the time that it was in which it was made, and in turn what that tells us about our time now, how that reflects, helps shape, or is reflected by our time today. And so your idea of talking about this, I thought that this was a great opportunity to not only talk about specific things that we like or don't like about TV, but to explore some of these trends and see where they go and where they came from, and to possibly be able to bring these things to the attention of people who had a general appreciation of the times or of TV, but might not have the specific level of knowledge or interest in it that we do.
I know that when we just finished the last show we did a few minutes ago, we were talking about, and we've mentioned a few times the uncertainty of where American television, network or otherwise, is going. And I think it's good to have a show like this, because even just 20 years from now, 30 years from now, people will look back, and some of the things that we're talking about, who knows if a Wikipedia or the internet as it is going to even, have that much information, or will it just be substanceless stuff. For example, just talking in that last show we just did, I thought a good idea for a future show, and I've got a list of 20 or 30, and I always ask Mitch to give an idea or two here or there. Who knows today now? UHF versus VHF. We need to do a show on what they were, why they were.
That was a significant issue.
Yeah. So let me just ask you, what's your earliest TV memory, Mitch?
The earliest memory that I can actually identify back to a specific time to say that I know the year, I know the date, the earliest thing I can remember is the 1965 Major League All-Star game, Major League Baseball All-Star game. The reason that made an impact on me is because they were playing the game in Minnesota, and the game was being televised in Minnesota, even though usually games were blacked out. Well, this was a big deal. And I was 5 years old. What did I know about how TV operated? But so it was a big deal that this game was actually on TV. You could see something that was happening just miles down the road. And so I specifically remember that. I think, if there's one, I don't know if there is one specific memory. I do remember specials from the time. I remember there was a Christmas special called The Legend of Silent Night. I remember the space shots. I can't date it, but I remember watching the Gemini launches, which would have been around that 1965 time period. I remember the death of the 3 Apollo astronauts. The anniversary of that just passed. So there are things that I can remember in a more vague idea. I remember The Fugitive from when I was growing up, not from when it was on the reruns. But I think that All-Star game is the first thing that I can absolutely pinpoint.
Yeah, I have a vague early memory, and I remember the first time I ever went to a movie theater. I remember it was like the 5th year anniversary re-release of The Sound of Music. I remember The Hills Are Alive and the face of Julie Andrews being 40 feet high and being like, wow, she's pretty. But with television, it's interesting. I remember there were things like Beat the Clock, the little game shows locally. I remember The Dating Game and that kind of thing. But I think the very earliest thing that I am 100% sure is not something that I've reinterpolated backwards is, remember when I was about 5 years old, I saw the Popeye cartoon, the Fleischer 30s cartoon, because there was a 30-minute Popeye show and in New York, and it was the Alibaba, not Alibaba, no, who's the sailor, not Alibaba, the great Sinbad the sailor.
Yes.
Popeye and Sinbad, with Bluto as Sinbad. And I remember when I watched it, I said, I remember that from about a year or so ago. So if I was 5 and a half, I must have been 3 and a half, 4. And that's the first, my memory is that I had a memory of that watching television. And it wasn't as significant as Julie Andrews, but the sort of the Russian doll effect of a memory within a memory comes to me. So
that's fascinating because as I said, I can remember The Fugitive. Can I remember a specific episode from then? No, but I remember the concept, and I remember the final episode being a big deal. So there is a connection there, but it doesn't sear itself into the vividness of a memory the way, as you said, the way movies do.
1986 when I got my first color TV set. When did you get? What year?
My grandparents got a color TV in 1970.
Ah.
So that was the first time I can remember, and I can remember I was watching a football game. Are you seeing a trend here in
Yeah.
sports? I was watching a game between the Vikings and the Chicago Bears from Wrigley Field in Chicago, where the Bears still played back then, and I watched about a little over half of it, and I got a headache from watching color TV.
Mm.
It wasn't because it wasn't a good game, but it was because I just wasn't used to seeing color. I think we got our very own color TV, our first color TV in the early 80s. But since we lived with my grandparents for a time, and I was down there a lot, and so that was my first extended exposure to color TV.
So similar to Popeye, the Popeye thing. I remember the very first like actress, going back to Julie Andrews, that I really thought was beautiful
Hmm.
was Candy Moore, the teenage daughter of Lucille
Ah,
Ball on the 1960s. Now, this would have been, I must have been 3 or 4 years old, 68,
uh-huh,
69. This would have been repeats because at that time there was a third Lucy show airing. And so I remember having three Lucy shows. There'd be I Love Lucy. There would be the '60s show with Candy Moore who was on for a year or two, and then there was the current Lucy show at that time that
uh-huh,
was airing. And the thing is, though, I had totally forgotten about her. Even though if you're a fan of rock music, the Cars, their album Candio, that's Candy Moore on a sketch of Candy Moore, all
uh-huh.
bodacious on the car. Um, but I'd forgotten about it until a few years ago, and it's interesting because my memory does those little tricks. And then as I got older, I mean, I remember when I was about 10, One Day at a Time came on, and of course I loved Valerie Bertinelli. She was this cute little Italian girl. And then about 10 years later, when the 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 Megan Follows miniseries from Canada on Anne of Green Gables, I was getting into the arts then. I was like, God, I wanted an artsy girl like that. So who were your crushes growing up in terms of actresses?
Well, the first one that I can remember was Juliet Mills from
Ah,
Nanny and the Professor.
oh yeah.
And I'm looking at one of my prized possessions here, which is a signed photo of her. And the only regret I have is that we weren't there to see. I was able to get it from a friend who was with her, and so it's personalized and everything. But I didn't actually get to meet her. But it's the next best thing is an autograph from her.
Mm.
So I remember thinking that she was the bee's knees back when I was that age and Nanny was on. When I got more serious, when I realized that girls could be a lot of fun, I think that I I when I got older, I remember thinking that somebody I would really like to know is Martha Quinn
Ah,
on MTV. She and I are about the same age. She's a year older than I am, and she was born a day after, but a year later or a year earlier. So we're the same age basically. And I can remember thinking, I'd like to know somebody like that who's cool, who knows what's going on, who's got that poise and confidence, and she's really cute too. But there were other actresses that I would see in various roles, but I think when you're talking about um, well, the other one I would mention is Yvonne Craig,
ah, yeah.
Batgirl.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I mentioned her last because I came to her more from the reruns
Mm.
than from the initial run. But frankly, I think if Yvonne Craig isn't on your list, then I think you have some serious problems of, with your discernment
Well, that that
process.
that that br- that brings up the question then: Yvonne Craig or Julie Newmar?
I'll go with Yvonne with no slight to Julie intended, but now Julie is somebody I've gotten a much greater appreciation for, not just only for her beauty, but for her talent. When we watched Batman a couple of years ago, there was an episode where she was Catwoman
Mm.
and she was calling pretending to be somebody else and put on this dumb ditzy kind of a voice while she's on the phone. And then I can't remember, she might have been working with the Sandman or one of those one-off type criminals, Michael Rennie. But she talked to him and put in the script and put him down in a voice that completely dropped all of her Catwoman stuff and sounded just like how she actually sounds today. And I thought that was a hilarious bit of acting on her part to drop her character for a moment, and her character becomes her real self. But she's a lot of fun to watch.
Ginger or Marianne?
Oh, Marianne. I should have mentioned her too. She definitely would have been one of the first crushes. I liked Ginger, but Marianne was always. I've got her autograph
and
too.
You may be too old to have watched the Brady Bunch, but then you'd have to ask Jan or Marsha.
Oh, I would say, I did see. I am probably in an older demographic to have a crush on them, but I probably would have gone with Marsha then. I don't know. I do have a fondness for fake Jan, but I would say that of the two of them in the real show, Marsha probably.
So, do you have any questions then?
Well, what's your favorite era of TV? I know you had mentioned in the previous show you haven't really watched a lot over the last few decades, but what's your favorite either decade or era of TV?
Well, I would have to say the 70s, simply because I was a child. The 70s, I think, was the heyday of Saturday morning television. I think if I think of the top 20 or 30 sitcoms, you got The Odd Couple, you've got the Norman Lear shows, you've got Bob Newhart, you've got the MTM shows, Mary Tyler Moore, you got Carol Burnett, you have the end of some of the great 60s shows bleeding into it, Mission Impossible, Hawaii Five-0, and then you have, Taxi then carrying over into the 80s, shows like that. If I think of shows that, like, on a per pound basis, if you will, I think the 70s was the best. That's not to say that, of course, it had a lot of crap too. You're always going to do. But yeah, again, I mentioned Dick Cavett, the television show.
Yep.
David Susskind, the interview shows. Tom Snyder. In virtually every form, soap operas were going through a revolution from 40 years on radio, the first 20 years on TV. They were changing with Luke and Laura and General Hospital and adventure shows and All My Children with more serious takes on some things. So I think that was probably Dark Shadows too, bled over from the 60s into the 70s. There you just seem to have a lot of, again, per pound, it seemed to have the best television.
I would agree that there's a lot of good programs, particularly in the early 70s.
Barney Miller too.
Yes, one of the best. I have a signed picture of Wojo and Barney too up there. So, I'll have to go through my rogues gallery sometime. It's kind of fun. But I have a fondness for the early to mid 60s shows, and I think that part of it is because in the TV guide collection that I've mentioned, when we were moving once, I came across a box that had a whole bunch of TV guides in it from the 60s, and it wasn't apparent to me at the time why on earth I would have kept this. And it turned out that with all of them, I could usually identify some reason why they had been kept in the family, whether it was because of a sporting event or a particular article or the JFK memorial issue or something like that. But when I would read through these, and I would read through them cover to cover until the covers began to fall off, and looked at all of these shows that I had vague memories of, like Combat, but that I couldn't remember seeing, actually, or that I wanted to see more of, where it was The Fugitive, or The Man from U.N.C.L.E., or some of these other shows that created kind of a mystique about them. A show like Sam Benedict, which was a law drama we talked about briefly once. Just this idea of seeing these titles that I was somewhat familiar with, or not familiar at all, but I was intrigued by them, and they had their own mystique about them. And when the DVD business started to take off, and at first you could get so many shows that they would never release now because they were kind of in a frenzy of releasing whatever they had. So you could get a show like Stony Burke, or you could get a show like The Outer Limits that I had seen vague memories of, but didn't have any memory of them. And now all of a sudden I could figuratively go back into time to these specific dates that were in these issues and watch the shows that I could have watched but wouldn't have been old enough to mean anything. So the era just before or just at the beginning of my level of consciousness has always been an interesting one for me.
Any other questions?
Well, I just finished updating my top 10 list on the blog. Not of the top 10 best shows, but my top 10 favorite shows. Do you have a favorite show? And if it's different, do you have a best show?
That was going to be one of my questions. My all-time favorite show, if I had just a week to watch, I'd have to go with The Odd Couple. I think Klugman and Randall are to television comedy teams what take your pick, Abbott and Costello, Laurel and Hardy, or the Marx Brothers are to the old time shows. If I were to pick one show that I would think is the best show, that if in the first 100 years or whatever of television I met some aliens, I would say The Prisoner. Patrick McGowan's The Prisoner. I mean, it sometimes it's a little wacky, a little dated, but it is fearless in just taking on this question of what we are, what do humans need to survive. It's very existential, it's very philosophical, and it doesn't blink.
I would agree with that. I don't know if I could ever say pinpoint one show that it's the greatest show of all time, but I would say that for a show that could go outside the box, I think The Prisoner is an example of what TV is capable of.
Yeah.
If you're looking for a more traditional type of show that maximizes the quality of acting and the quality of its scripts and its stories, I might, if I was forced to pick one, I might go with the police drama Naked City.
That's a good
and
one.
It was always well written, literate, and it had exceptional acting from all of the leads, and they became characters. When I say predictable characters, I don't mean predictable in a bad way, but I mean characters who acted in ways that were consistent with how they had been built up, so that you knew, for instance, that one of them would say or do a certain thing. You could depend on it, not because it was a cliche, but because Paul Burke had done such a fine job building up his character of Adam, that you knew that this is how Adam would react in a certain situation. It wasn't out of character. My number one favorite show right now, and this is a very fluid list because for a number of years, Doctor Who, the classic version, was my favorite show, and that still is a show that I was taken with in a way that I don't know that I've ever been taken with another show, in wanting to consume the information that was out there. Judd for the Defense, the legal drama, I thought when I watched that 3 years ago, I was struck by what a good show it was, and how strong Carl Betts was in the role. If you're of an era where you primarily remember Carl Betts from being Donna Reed's husband, you watch him in Judd for the Defense, and you see a range that he always had, because he was always a very good dramatic actor, but you just didn't associate it with him. And he became a character. I don't often use this word to describe a character, but he became, as a character, someone was very fond of. Um, there's a British show called Maigret that dates back to the early 60s, and Rupert Davies played Maigret in this version. It was from the BBC. He had that same effect, a very warm character that I became very fond of. But if I would have to name my favorite show right now, which is a really off-the-wall pick for me, it's the original version of Top Gear, the car show from the UK. Before and later on, when it came over to Amazon and became the Grand Tour. But Top Gear, for being a car show for a guy who doesn't like to drive cars, and it was one of the few shows I'd have ever seen as a comedy that makes me laugh out loud. Usually when I see a show that's funny, I'll chuckle, I'll grin inwardly. I'm not usually very demonstrative when I'm watching TV unless I'm angry, but Top Gear is one of the few shows that I would just sit there on the couch and laugh, and sometimes I'd have to pause it until I was done laughing, because we didn't want to miss anything and we couldn't hear it the way we were laughing. But these guys were so ridiculously over the top that it's a wonderful show for me, anyway.
The British sci-fi shows of the 70s, I think, were very underrated. Burke's 7
Yep.
is a really good one. And Tom Baker, the Tom Baker Doctor Who,
yes.
that's people say it's the first Doctor Who that's always your favorite. That's not true. Baker was my second. I forget the guy who was the first right before him. That was the first one I saw.
John Pertwee?
Pertwee, that's right, yeah. But I still remember 2 episodes of Doctor Who. One I only saw one time, and it was maybe the early 80s, and it was from the late 60s. It was a Doctor Who episode, the guy before Pertwee, when they did the OK Corral. And it was like watching an old Philco, theater production, because it might have been done live. But I remember the darkness and the shadows, and it reminded me of the Quatermass television stuff.
Oh, there's some exceptional stuff from.
Yeah,
okay, well,
speaking. Wait, one other thing.
Yep.
There's an episode you may remember it. Doctor Who goes back in time 4 billion years, and he's there, I think, on Earth when life first happens or something. And I remember thinking, it was cheesy and whatnot. And I remember the final episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, where Q takes Picard to the same basic time. And I remember thinking, that's so much better in terms of visually Star Trek was, but the real show that was interesting, the one that had me, was the Doctor Who version.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a Tom Baker story that's near and dear too, called Genesis of the Daleks, because the Daleks are probably the most evil creation that you've ever seen on TV. And at the final part of Genesis of the Daleks, the Doctor has the chance to have gone back in time and to have ignited an explosion that would prevent the Daleks from ever having been. And he refuses to do it. He says, do I have the right to exterminate another species, even an evil species? And he came up with something at the end that I always remember as being very profound, which was that he was convinced that even out of the most evil things the Daleks did, good would come from it. And people would unite, planets would unite, people would do heroic things, make great sacrifices. Some good would come out of even the most evil thing. And I thought, for a TV show, that's quite something to say.
Speaking of cheesy sci-fi, what show do you think had the most potential in or out of sci-fi but never lived up to it? I'll give you my choice. 1972, Harlan Ellison, Star-Lost, with Keir Dullea in the 2001 team. It's about this giant ark that's going through space. It's got the same level of effects as Doctor Who or Burke's, or Burke's. Was it Burke 7? Blake 7. Blake 7. Yeah. I was thinking of Burke Slaw. Blake 7. And yet it only, I think, has 16 or 17 episodes, maybe the same, or maybe 13. It's about the same length of The Prisoner. And the first shows, intellectually, it's interesting. It has this computer that, hello, may I help you? That comes. It had such potential, and yet they didn't fund the show, and it lasted less than one season, and became, Harlan Ellison disowned it even.
Wow. I think, surprisingly enough, I think Star Trek, the original Star Trek, had the potential to be a better show than it was. And owning the series, I obviously don't think it's a bad show. But there were some exceptional shows dealing with serious topics, and I think that the show had the potential to do more like that. And I also think that they had the potential to do something that you don't often see in science fiction, which is just to appreciate the awe and wonder of what the universe is like. Kirk would come close to it sometimes when you talk about out there, but I think that I never had the vision of them as the explorers. They were on a mission, but the awe and wonder of it, I think they could have done more with. And I think that The Outer Limits was a superior science fiction show in many respects, but if the network had stopped meddling, and if the original writers had stayed with it, and the original production crew, there were some stunning episodes that they did in the first season that dealt with some very serious issues. And I think that show could have done more of doing sci-fi's traditional role, which is to explore contemporary issues through an allegorical show of the future.
Well, I think in the original Star Trek episode, they made a big mistake with the second pilot with Gary Mitchell, the guy from 2001, the actor. Is that thing where they gain some superpower in they should have done, they later went with Khan and the augments and genetic, and that's interesting, and it has its place. But I would have liked to have also seen if Gary Mitchell and some of the people who developed these godlike powers, was this the beginning of the Q? Are they humans? There's so much that they could have done, but then they pulled back on it, and a lot of the inconsistencies, that plagued that show.
Yeah, it's kind of like something my wife refers to as the rest of the story, where we'll see an episode of some show and she'll say, "Wouldn't you like to know what the rest of the story is there? What happened after that?" And it's that same kind of thing. You'd like to see what happened after the cameras went off and the crew went off to a different mission. Now, obviously that can't happen when they preempt it with some action the way they did in that episode. But there are others where you leave the planet and you think to yourself, wouldn't you like to see what the next act is?
Well, I do. My favorite moment from that show, I forget which episode it was, but there's a usual crisis, and they're in, I guess, the meeting room where Kirk says something like to Spock, says, "But risk is our business." And I thought that's the perfect example of the explorer. And it's one of the reasons why for me the first Star Trek will always be the best show. Is that if I had to serve with someone, I'm serving with Kirk. Because he can be a cowboy, but he's not some over the top, they make it seem as if every episode he's squiring around some alien babe. I think there's 6 or 7 episodes where that happens. But and I think yes, he's melodramatic, but his character is written that way. He has that perfect hilting voice. Plus the big three there of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. There's no other. in all of the other shows, I never get a sense of a real friendship between any of the characters on that show. Yes, they may be friendly, but you have the sense with the three main characters from the original show, even though it's written in the dark ages compared to, the 30 something and the revolution of the 80s. You mentioned NYPD Blue, more realism, even though it's a less character realistic show in many ways. The way that they kid each other, the McCoy and Spock's banter back and forth. I mean, that's the way people really act, and you don't really get that. I really like the new show that they've done. I've seen the first 3 seasons with Pike, the Pike character, Strange New Worlds. But by the same token, the worst aspect of that, and I think that's the best human show since the original show. I really did like the cartoon version of Star Trek too as a kid, but there's a lot of just mouthing off. I'm gonna some. It's like when you have the bratty kid on a sitcom who always does something. There's these bratty characters that always have to chime in, and this is a military organization at its root. Where Star Trek in a sense is like being on a submarine. There's a few episodes like that, and so little things like that I found niggling. But I do agree. For example, Outer Limits. Some of the great shows. Demon with a Glass Hand, the Harlan Ellison one. The one where the aliens come to take some kids back to a planet, kids who are crippled or something. That one is there, and even the lesser ones, the Monster of the Week ones, with David McCallum morphs into a superhuman and then back, and I think he becomes a subhuman or something.
Yeah, there are some deep things there to bring up some very existential questions there.
Yeah.
Now, as far as questions, though, I would be remiss, since we talked about TV crushes, if I didn't ask, who is your favorite Doctor Who companion?
Romana, was it? Romana? She was with Tom Baker, right?
Yes, there were 2 Romanas, Romana 1 and Romana 2.
Yeah, I can't. I'd have to see them, but
Romana 2 had long, straight hair, and she was on longer. Romana 1 had dark, shorter hair.
I always would have loved to have seen Doctor Who go back in time or something and meet up with the Avengers and Emma Peel.
That would have been fun. My favorite companion, because I have to answer that, has to be Sarah Jane Smith. I always thought that she was a fun character, and cute, but she was a fun character too. I would have to say that you'd have to go a long way to top her as a companion.
Well, let me ask my final question, and then if you have a question or two, you ask it. What is your favorite single moment ever on television? I'll give you mine. 1977 World Series, Yankees versus Dodgers, Game 6, Reggie Jackson, 1, 2, 3 swings, 3 home runs on 3 straight pitches. The Yankees win. This is New York during the Serpico era, during Goodfellas era, during the Son of Sam killings, during race riots, during a blackout. Everything that could the city is banged. Everything that could go wrong there goes wrong. And then all of a sudden, sports, every sportsman, every athlete says that the hardest thing to do in professional sports, at least, is hit a baseball. Here's a guy who hits 400-foot moonshots, 3 straight pitches, 3 straight swings. It's like,
I remember that. Yeah,
he was like touch. It's like the Michelangelo, when God touches the finger. God touched Reggie Jackson on those 3 swings.
I think that's a really interesting question. I'm thinking of sport, although I will say that when Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, I don't know that you would call that a favorite moment. It is an unforgettable moment to have seen it live. I don't know that anything compares to that, but I think my favorite moment is also a sports one, and it came from the English Premier League soccer when the final day of the season, this had to be back 10, 11, 12 years ago, before Manchester City had become a dynasty, when they were trying to win their first championship since the 60s. And it was a must-win situation. If they lost, they'd lose the title. If they drew, they'd lose the title. Then there's no overtime. If they win the title. So that's the only possibility. And with they're going into the 5 minutes of stoppage time, and they're behind 2-1. So that's 2-1 stoppage time. People are giving up already, and they scored with a little less than 5 minutes to play to tie the game, but they still have to win it. And I remember turning to my wife and saying, now they decide that they're going to play. Great. But they came back down, and they made one last desperate rush in what had to be the last minute of play, maybe the last 30 seconds, and the ball comes loose in the front, and their great player of the time, Sergio Aguero, punts the ball into the net to win the game, and the announcers are going berserk in the booth, just Aguero, and almost all of them are saying some version of, you will never see anything like this again as long as you live. And the crowd is, you can see people weeping in the crowd, and his teammates are jumping up on top of him. And after being a team that was perpetually number 2 in the Manchester market behind United, and a team that always seemed to have the knack of finding a way to take defeat from the jaws of victory. And if they had lost, it would have been such a typical loss for them. And to see that happen, I can remember agreeing completely that this was probably something that you would never see again. And then when you go, I every once in a while I'll go back and watch different versions of it, depending on whether it was the ESPN broadcast or the broadcast and the international feed, or the broadcast that they have on Sky Sports, where they aren't actually showing the game, but they're doing a watch along in the studio. And when the guy says that they scored again, and they've got guys falling off of their stools, and you can hear people in the background yelling and shouting. And they talked about how in ESPN, before soccer was a big sport as it is today, that people in the booth back in Connecticut were standing around watching this on the monitors there. And then it wound up being on the front of CNN, on their national news, not their sports page. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. I really don't. And I whether you like City today or not, you can't help but enjoy that scene.
It's interesting to hear an American be such a fan of soccer. I remember when I was a kid, soccer from Europe was on Channel 17 or Channel 31, 2 PBS channels in New York. Mm-hmm. And I remember it would either be Spanish language, which you only knew something was good by the way people's voice went up. Or I remember the Scottish League. You'd hear some of that. It is 0-0. What a game it was! And I'm an American. I'm saying they didn't score. No one scored. They're just running back, and it's like these people are going crazy. And it's like I couldn't. It was just odd. But I do remember. I do remember, and maybe as a soccer fan, you might remember, late 70s, there was a North American soccer league with Pele, yes, and whatnot. But then there was also the major indoor soccer league. Yep, I remember that. And I remember the first 4 championships were won by the New York Arrows. A guy named Steve Zungel was their top scorer. And
for some unknown reason,
it was like hockey.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, they played in the Nassau Coliseum at least some of the time. And when the Arrows would score, they had this air raid siren that they would blow, and it wasn't like your normal siren. This was the kind of thing that you listen to when you're in Minnesota in tornado season, and they're telling you to get out, get into your basements. It was that kind of a siren, and it was great. But I remember when I told our friends, I can't watch hockey anymore. There's no action in it. There's no scoring. This was the clutch and grab era in the
Yeah.
late 90s. And I said, leave it to me to give up hockey in favor of the lowest scoring sport.
Yeah.
Only I would say hockey's too dull. I have to watch soccer.
Yeah. Well, anything else you want to add?
If there was, I'll just if there was one show that you could have come back, either because it's not on video, or that you'd like to have seen them make more episodes, what would it be?
What episodes? There was a show. Oh, what the hell was it? I think it was called The Insiders. It was. It had a. It was the mid '80s. A guy, an actor, a white actor from Canada, and a black actor from America, Stoney Jackson or something. It was called. And Phil Collins did the song. I let me look it up here. It was I thought a pretty good show, and the guy later became a superstar in Canada. The white guy, The Insiders. Let's see, maybe it's The Outsiders TV show, because let's see. Oh yeah, okay. So The Insiders TV series, an American drama series that aired on ABC.
Hey.
September 25th, 85 till June 2nd, 86. Nicholas Campbell.
Ah.
You probably know the name. Nicholas
Yep.
Campbell and Stoney Jackson. I was right, Stoney Jackson.
Yeah.
And let me see. The Insiders song, theme song. I'm not going to play it, otherwise I'll get a strike or something. But the song's theme, 50... song theme, wait, for the Insiders, Phil Collins. Let's see. Not that I was a big Phil Collins fan, but it was one of his better songs, I thought.
He has his moments, yeah.
TV song was sung by Genesis, Just a Job I Do.
Ah, that's good.
Yeah.
I think, there are a lot of series that we've seen that at the end of the series we'll say, boy, I wish there were more to watch. I mentioned Breaking Point. I wish I could see all the episodes. I wish they'd release the second season of The 11th Hour. I wish Judd for the Defense had made more episodes. But I think if I could have one, which was my question, and I better be able to answer it, if I could have one, I think, and I've written about this on my website before, I would like to have seen a final episode of Hogan's Heroes. I would have liked to have seen them get out of there, because one thing Hogan mentions many times, or at least several times during the course of this series, is that when I leave, I'm going out the front gate. He's not going to escape. There isn't going to be anything like that. When I leave, I'm going out the front gate. And I would have enjoyed seeing the series wrapped up and see how they handled that. I think that would have been one of those rest of the story moments.
They probably would have had the Russians rescue them and take them to a gulag. But and I thought too, another series that I think I would have liked to have seen more of, not because it was so great, but the Prisoner spawned a show on, I think it was UPN, called Nowhere Man, with who the hell was it? He also played Captain Pike. Let me see, Nowhere Man. It ran for 25 episodes. I have a DVD box set from some guy who did it by himself. Not the Nowhere Man. God, and that's the Beatles. Nowhere Man TV. Nowhere Man TV show. American Thriller. Yeah. Nowhere Man, starring Bruce Greenwood, Lawrence Herzog. That was instead of taking a guy, putting him on an island that he needed to escape in The Prisoner. This was a guy who was hunted by a shadow organization because he took a random photo in some Latin American jungle about a so-called execution. And then he goes to the bathroom, takes a piss, comes back, and his wife claims she doesn't know him. Everything's been changed. What they did was they made it at the end that he was a brainwashed operative and that life wasn't his own. but there are things that are in the series earlier, some of the episodes that people clearly knew him as the character Tom Vale. That was the name. And so that's another one that I wish had come back for a second season, and they hadn't had that. The last 2 or 3 episodes just went against what had come before. It had the potential to be a really great show.
I think Cornet Blue did too, and that's what I would wrap up with. I would have liked to have seen the final episode of Cornet Blue, but I also would have liked to have seen them do a better job with the concept of it. Instead, some of the episodes are quite weak in the middle of the series. There are some better ones toward the end, and it's a fun show to watch. I'm glad I own it.
And I think the actor. I always liked the actor.
Frank Converse, yeah.
He later was in the Anne of Green Gables sequel.
But I think that that Cornet Blue is an example of one of those shows you talk about that say, oh, if you only had reached your potential on that, because it could have been a lot better, and I would have liked to have seen them wrap it up.
But all of those shows where someone is being pursued, even going back to The Fugitive, and I like David Jansen. He was a big star. I mentioned my little porno movie episode about with the director who knew David Jansen, but they all have those kinds of shows where they are the guest star in their own show for some little drama for that episode. And while I understand the need for that to fill out 25, 30 shows, whatever the seasons were in those years, it does take away from the psychological intensity and identification with the character. Yes, you Kimball, Kimball or this Tom Vale or Number 6, you identify with them, but I think some of those shows just become too rote. But anyway.
Well, they spend a lot of time reacting to situations rather than instigating them themselves. And of course, in Kimball's case, you could make the case that he had no alternative. That's a tricky concept to run with, but I know what you mean. You'd like to see them be the instigators of the action rather than simply reacting to what other characters do.
And of course, the worst example of this is probably the least episode in The Prisoner, where McGowan is only there for the first minute and the last minute. It's another guy. They switch bodies.
He's off doing Ice Station Zebra or something. How would you like to be that other guy, though, who has to somehow communicate McGowan's mannerisms and thought process, but still be himself?
And there's the scene where Number 6 apparently had, well, we don't know if it's true, but apparently he had a fiance or a girlfriend, and she's half a foot taller than him, when she wasn't a half a foot taller than McGowan.
Yeah, let me see if I can explain this.
Anyway, so that's good. Hopefully, people have enjoyed our reminiscing, and we'll be back next month with another episode, and we'll kick it around, Mitch.
Looking forward to it. See you then, Dan.